Добро, здраво на сите. Фала ви многу што дојдовте. Поводот за нашето собирање денес е помалку или повеќе формалистички, но тоа не значи дека е испразнет од важна содржина. Имено поводот е ERASMUS стратешкото партнерство со наслов Geo-philosophy на Балканот, каде што се вклучени повеќе истражувачки тимови и повеќе академски институции. Од Скопје, всушност, координатор институцијата е АУЕФОН универзитетот, од Белград Сингидунум универзитетот, од Атина Пантеон, потоа Неапол Ориентале и универзитетот во Верона, од Верона во Верона. Тоа наше здружување во рамки на ова ERASMUS стратешко партнерство има повеќе цели, но водечката и покровителната цел, би рекла, е да се обидеме како што се обидовме и всушност, би рекла, со успех го завршивме тој дел, значи да дизајнираме критички интердисциплинарен курикулум, односно мастер и докторска интегрирана програма за критички интердисциплинарни студии за Балканот. Тој програм во овој момент е идеално типски, не постои никаде. Нашата надеж е дека еден ден ќе биде достапен за студентите од регионот и пошироко. Во овој момент напредокот со кој сме, да речам, горди, и заради кој што се сретнавме, кој што не потикна на оваа средба, се 12 силабуси развиени во рамки на 4 пилари. Тоа се Bodies Politics, потоа Memory Studies, потоа критика на илиберални идеологии и последното е политика на миграција, граници и заедници. Идеално тоа би биле 4 модули кои што некакви потенцијални студенти ќе може да ги изберат и ќе може да следат предавања, да учествуваат во вон курикуларни активности и некако да се како да кажам, да се вградат во една поинаква реалност и во овој регион и во цела Европа, би рекла, затоа што нештата се прилично загрижувачки. Во овој формален дел сакам да упатам несомнена благодарност до ректорката Билјана Пулеска, која што овозможува некаков, како да кажам, академски дом за ова партнерство и го поддржува. Истовремено би сакала навистина така лефтерно да спомнам дека настанот е организиран всушност во соработка со една неформална иницијатива која што оваа година прави 5 години постоење. Тоа е критичко преиспитување на правото, една, не знам веќе како да кажам, дали може би Дон Кихотовска иницијатива, но која што во известни моменти можеше да ја анимира заедницата по која што посегавме, а тоа е заедницата на љубопитни. Во оваа линија на некакви, како да кажам, пригодни говори, не можам да не го спомнам просторот кој што беше отворен за авторот кој што е денес со нас, мислителот Boaventura de Sousa Santos, еден фасцинантен лик. Имено Ивана Dragsic пред некое време ја уреди книгата Друг свет, тука ја има денес на располагање, може да земете бесплатни примероци. Во неа се наоѓа и еден текст кој што ги сумира главните негови концепти, а кој што пак навистина длабоко ценам дека може и се блиски до нашите и места на анализа, но и места на потенцијал. Истовремено и последно треба да ја спомнам во оваа линија и локомотива и нејзината активност, посебно со последниот проект кој што е насловен Уметност, клима, промена. Исто и тоа беше платформа за, како да кажам, размена околу некои важни теми, а цело време по линија на теоретскиот мисловниот и практичниот корпус на Boaventura de Sousa Santos, кој што вечерва е денес со нас. Мислам дека сите, кои знае колку пати веќе сте го видели описот на настанот и абстрактите и биографиите, малку беше така присутно кампањски како да кажам, собирањето луѓе, така да нема да го направам тој и вечерва да исчитувам повторно нешто што сигурно сте го виделе. Ќе продолжам со еден мој не многу самоуверен обид да го земам вашето внимание и потоа да им го подарам на Iain и на Боа, кои што вечер треба да се ангажираат во некаков тип на диалог, после што следува тоа што беше веќе најавено, круг на интервенции. Предизвик е да се стокмат соодветно првите 2-3 воведни реченици за настанот што следува, за неговото намерно повеќе гласие, имено од диалогот помеѓу Iain и Боа, до интервенциите кои потоа ќе следуваат од професорката Seleva, од Slavco Dimitrov, од Stamatia Portanova, од Универзитетот во Ориентале и од Ivana Dragsic потенцијално. Размислав многу како да започнам, а да не ризикувам некаков тип на застранување, но еве ќе ризикувам, па потоа ќе видиме. Iain во таа смисла знаеше колку сум стресирана и се зафркаваше синоќе на вечера и ми вика: почни со стратешко зачудување, со една реплика од романот Дракула: "There shall be to you many strange things tonight." Океј, не знам, еве, нека биде таа некаква отварачка линија. Јас нема да ги антиципирам различните гласови што вечерва ќе ги слушнеме. Само ќе ја споделам мојата интимна појдовна точка на очекување и можно разбирање на тоа што би следувало. Тука несомнено е содржана структурата на политичкиот мит за нацијата и национализмот, застапен на Балканот. Не балкански, туку застапен и на Балканот. Имено митот во кој утробата и гробот го ограничуваат движењето и го прават затворено кружно. Секогаш се инсистира на враќање кон замислен почеток, до кој веднаш најдобро е да тлее искуството на крајот. Па така, можеби, референтниот херој станува очигледно за сите националистички самобитности, нели токму Одисеј. Во еден фантастичен текст фантастичен текст со наслов "Нацијата помеѓу трагедија и идила", се упатува токму на Одисеј и во тој текст има обид да се декодираат остатоците од тој политички мит во тековното политичко на следниот начин. Авантурата или движењето на Одисеј е секогаш преживување. Целта не е ни самата победа против тројанците, туку враќањето кон утробата во која се развива суштината, се стекнува идентитетот. Оваа постапка, која стои како ориентацијска точка за време на целата негова авантура, го определува Одисеј како носач на културно-политичкиот поредок и тоа го тера да ја заштити суштината, својата мерка или својот идентитет и да направи да опстојат, така што се што е надвор од таа мерка, од тој идентитет, се што е друго за Одисеј е зверско, непријателско и треба да се уништи. Митскиот идентитет имено ја уништува другоста. И трето, последно, враќањето во Итака е враќање во утробата гроб, односно во затвореноста на значењата. Зошто е опасна, според мене, оваа херојска траекторија, која несомнено е многу блиска до националистичкото херојство, што ги блокира модерните доминантни форми, меѓу нив и балканските. Не исклучиво само балканските, туку и балканските. Прво, поставувањето на својата мерка, на својот идентитет како исклучив означувач, на сметка на ништање на се што е можно друго, различно, нужно, како што може да видиме, политичката реалност ја прави насилна. И второ, враќањето во утробата гроб значи дека еден простор кој е многу важен за афирмативните политики и пракси, просторот на отвореноста, е под закана. Ние мора да го браниме просторот на отвореноста, ние мора да ја браниме отвореноста. И нашата средба, јас денес ја доживувам така, ние сме овде во име на таа одбрана. И во таа одбрана, фигурите со кои оперираат Iain и Boa, како мислење со Балканот или екологија на знаење, може да помогнат, може да спријателат. Сега ќе продолжиме со нивните две излагања, после што веднаш ќе започне тој круг на интервенции со професорката Шелева прво, потоа Славчо, потоа Стаматија, потоа Ивана и потоа ќе имаме простор и за прашања и одговори, кои што би било најдобро да бидат кратки. Тоа е тоа. Фала ви многу. Iain?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm sorry that I can't speak Macedonian. Viki was kind enough to translate a little bit of what she just said to you, so I have a summary of it. It's a great pleasure to be here with you, together with my dear friend Iain Chambers, because I think this is the place to discuss some of the issues, a good place to discuss some of the issues that I've been discussing, studying and working on for some decades. Even though I have never been here in Skopje. I was in Yugoslavia, but many years ago, a country that does not exist anymore. What is knowledge? I have been very much concerned with questions of knowledge, epistemology, basically because knowledges are ways of representing the world as our own. We have knowledge of something of the world in which we live by representing it as our own. And it's very important to represent it as our own because that's the only way to transform it according to our aspirations, desires, and objectives. Well, in the modern history of Europe, something happened in the 16th century, in fact, in which the early part, my own country, I come from Portugal, was very active in that, which is modern Western colonialism. And when the European expansion takes place, what's going to happen is that we are going to have an interruption of histories of people around the world and of knowledges that have always existed around the world. Because at that time, with the European expansion, there is a model of knowing, of knowledge, which is the Western knowledge, that is going to be considered the only genuine, rigorous knowledge. And this rigorous knowledge imposes a break with the histories of the people that existed there. All of a sudden, these people are imposed to abandon their own histories, sometimes for thousands of years, and start a new history, the history under European colonialism. And this interruption is going to be very serious for these people, because if they cannot represent the world as their own, they cannot transform it according to their aspirations. That is to say, now the representation is the European, the Eurocentric one, and the transformation of the world is according to the European design. Well, and this design imposes lots of violence against the people that are going to meet outside Europe, beginning from North Africa, from Sousa, is the first city, in 1415, and then going down the rest of Africa, the West Africa, and then Latin America, and then the Indian Ocean, and then Asia, right? So all this is a political endeavor, an economic endeavor, and an epistemological endeavor, because the colonizers take with them what they consider to be the only rigorous knowledge, the only rigorous religion, their own rigorous way of looking at the world. And they impose it by violence, symbolic violence, evangelization, or conquest, as the Crusades have done against the Muslim world before. So this new model is a model that is very interesting because it's very paradoxical. It's very, very intense, very creative, very innovative, and at the same time very destructive, very exclusionary. And the way in which it excludes is a very paradoxical way, because it excludes in the name of universal ideas. All of us are divine creatures, first. All of us are born free and equal with the French Revolution. There are universal principles, but then, because the Europeans control the knowledge that counts, immediately the people that do not control that knowledge are going to be considered subhumans, primitives, savages, backward people, etc., etc. So they don't have the real knowledge that Eurocentric knowledge has. So this is going to be not just an epistemological feat, but a social, political, and cultural one. It's going to draw an abyssal line, and all my work is about the abyssal line. The abyssal line is a line that divides between the rigorous knowledge and the superstition, the non-European knowledge that is not validated by science or by Western philosophy or Western theology. And this abyssal line is also a line that divides the humans that are on the metropolitan side, on our side of the line, that control that knowledge, and the others. And the others, even though the principles say that they are free and equal, and equality of divine grace upon them, they are considered as subhumans, treated as subhumans, be they slaves, be they women, be they Africans, be they indigenous peoples, be they people from other religions. So we have this idea of a natural inferiority that is going to be created together with the principle of equality. We even have paradoxical ideas that we'd even notice the contradiction in them. For instance, we have been studying and talking about European universalism. Well, if it is European, it's not universal. If it is universal, it's not European. But this paradox is going unnoticed. So strong are the ideas. Of course, the fact that the principles, the general principles of equality, of freedom, of fraternity, they are imposed from the Western-centric core. But that doesn't mean much. People can appropriate those ideas, and they have appropriated those ideas. The problem is that there are these principles and not others are not admitted. Secondly, we always compare. It's very interesting. If you read the history from the 16th century onwards, we compare the European principles with the practices of the Africans, of the Asians, of the Latin Americans, indigenous people, etc. They don't have principles. We have principles. They have practices. And the practices are horrible. They are cannibalism. They are violent. They destroy things. We never contrast our principles with our practices. And the practices, of course, as you can see, were very contradictory with the principles. John Locke, the great theoretician of liberal ideas, universal principles, was a slave owner. Voltaire traded in the slave business. All the founders of the American Republic, Jefferson, George Washington, Madison, all of them had slaves. And there was no contradiction. Why? Because slaves were not people, were property, were commodities. So there was no contradiction. We could have slaves and be genuinely in favor of universal principles. So this is the trick that transforms the idea of humanity from a reality into a project. We cannot have humanity without subhumans, be they slaves, be they women, be they racialized bodies, blacks, indigenous people. And up until today, so we are going to have a development in which capitalism develops together with colonialism and patriarchy. These are the three main modes of domination in our time: capitalism, colonialism, and patriarchy. What is the difference between the three? Is that capitalism requires equality, free. The worker is free to take a job or not to take, while colonialism portrays the inferiority of someone, the ontological degradation of someone because of racial inferior, and women because they are also inferior. So this idea of there are humans that are inferior to others is something that is embedded in our culture up until today. So I have been, in my work, been showing that historical colonialism disappeared, but the real colonialism, that is to say, the idea of degrading some people, diminishing some people because of race, because of sex, because of religion, is with us all the time. And I try to explain why. Well, all my work has been done comparing the realities in Europe with my empirical work in Asia, in Africa, and in Latin America. But recently, I have been working in Europe. I conduct a very broad general project funded by the European Union, the European Research Council, a very expensive one, I have to say, but bringing together people from different continents to show why Europe should develop a new vision of the world, have a more cordial, a more horizontal view of the world. Why do we have to consider everything that is outside Europe as inferior and so on? But then I looked closely and said, well, this way of looking hierarchically is very much embedded in Europe itself. So my work now is to see how we create hierarchies in Europe. And I started with Southern Europe. Why? Because Portugal and Spain have always been considered less developed than the rest of Europe. And if you go to the texts of the 17th and 18th century, the texts, particularly by monks that visit the peninsula there, they consider the Portuguese and the Spaniards are ignorant, lazy, lascivious, they like sex basically, not very hygienic. What they say about us is what we were saying about the natives in Latin America, about the indigenous people. We are considered savage. The natives of that country, those countries in Latin America and in Asia, they were ignorant, they were lazy, they were primitive, and so on. The same thing that the monks used to say about the Europeans, about the Portuguese and Spaniards. And in fact, the North Italians vis-à-vis the Southern Italians. So I look at that and I say, well, I mean, we have to analyze further what's going on. And I come up with the idea of, based on my colleagues from Latin America, on the ideas of internal colonialism. There is internal colonialism in Europe. And when I was analyzing, for instance, the financial crisis of 2011 in Greece, and then went to all the regions, to Portugal and Spain and Italy, I was reading, because I studied in Germany also before going to the United States, where I've been living for the last 35 years, I went there to see how the German press treated the Greeks as inferior. The Greeks don't know how to manage their things. They are very lazy. They don't. They like the sun and go to the beach and the drinking. And so while we, the Germans, we know everything. We are very sober and so on and frugal. So these the ideas of looking at the other as inferior. And all of a sudden, I came to see that the same mechanism is at work in the Balkans. So the Balkans have also a long history. I've been reading a lot about the Balkans recently because I was here in 1980 in Belgrade, Sarajevo, and so on. I mean, I was not in Skopje. I was there for a long visit, in fact, for a month, and then to Albania. Well, at the time, there was no talk of the Balkans. It was the Southeast Europe. Balkans was not a word in our lexicon. But then it came very much as a lexicon to degrade this region. And then when we look at the texts that have been produced recently, and not so recently, you can see that the Balkans have always been victims of internal colonialism. The Chancellor of the Austrian Empire in 1840 said Asia begins at Landstrasse. The Landstrasse was the street in Vienna where the immigrants from the Balkans lived. So he said that Asia is not Europe anymore. So the Balkans were not Europe, were something else, right? They are very violent. Some texts say they are violent, ungovernable, a black hole. Brigands, they have to be tutored by the old Europe. So this idea of even the concept of Balkanizing and so on becomes a kind of a negative, pejorative type of word, you know. So I noticed that we have different generations or genealogies of internal colonialism in Europe, based on the same idea of epistemic superiority, which is also political superiority. We in the Southern Europe are lazy, ignorant, and so on. You are violent here, around here. That's the idea of violence, particularly, is the one that comes out more strongly. So I think that this internal colonialism is doing in Europe what it was done outside Europe. That is to say, ancient histories, long histories are cut. People cease to have the capacity to represent the world as their own. And I see that in Portugal and Spain these days. I mean, we have to be like Europe. We have to catch up. We never catch up, is the principle. But we have to think that we are going to catch up, to be the same as. But as Omi Baba said, to be the same as, assimilated is not to be the same. It's to get closer without ever getting closer. So I noticed that this idea is a maneuver of the past that you have to interrogate very deeply. Why? Because the past becomes a closed past with a break between the dominant powers and whatever existed before. And whatever existed before doesn't count, is erased. And erased very drastically with the rise of nationalisms throughout our regions. So what happens here in epistemic terms is a dialectics between roots and options. Some roots are selected as being the genuine ones, and some roots are discarded, put away, and forgotten. So roots becomes options because we really select the roots that we want and erase all the others. So this is what I think is going on in Europe these days, in the peripheries of Europe, which is in fact accounting for much of the political behavior that we noticed in Europe and makes things so difficult. I think it's no surprise for many of you that all the time that this region has been taking to enter the European Union is because of colonial prejudice against the Balkans, as that exists against other countries. Turkey is another one, of course, even though part of Turkey is Europe. As part of 80% of Russia is Europe, and now it's just the opposite of Europe. So I can see these manipulations, and they work because there are the local elites that favor that. So the abyssal line is working in the Balkans as is working in the Southern Europe. And sometimes I think that we should join forces, probably the peripheries of Europe, to get united about this narrative, dominant narrative that keeps us always in the margins, so to say, right? And the abyssal line, as a display, I have to say that being here since yesterday, not a long time, but I was impressed, and I've been reading, preparing for this trip, and also I had a beautiful guide, which is my friend, Iain Chambers. I'm sorry for my throat. But I have been looking at the city, and I would like to propose something that is probably scandalous, but this is a small group, so you are not going to beat me up, because we are in democracy. I'd like to propose you an imaginary experiment, because I've been working a lot in visual sociology and urban sociology. And when I look at your city, let's imagine that the Varna River is the abyssal line. And then I look at the south bank, and it looks like, to me, that there are the options that become the roots, the official roots of Macedonia. Here we have the status, the monumentalization of the heroes, founding heroes of this country, and of religion. And there is a kind of an intense production of roots that is metaphorically present in the oversize of the statues. I have to confess that I have never seen so many statues per quadrat meter in a city like in Skopje. The oversize and the title, which is quite legitimate if the people want to honor their heroes. So you can see that there are some roots that have been selected as the genuine roots. But there is an abyssal line, because that's the other bank where we are now. And it looks like the history of this bank is completely different. They are the roots that have been discarded. The Ottoman Empire, the Muslim world, which is part of this region, of course. As in Southern Europe, you know that the Arab world, the Islamic world, was in Europe for 7 centuries, in Andalusia. And we, in Spain, there is an attempt to recover that heritage. Because after all, we know Aristotle, and we know the Greeks through the Muslim translators, from Baghdad in 9th century. They were the ones that translate for us. So we are very grateful to the Toledo School of Translation from 2050 onwards that translate them. We are recovering that past. So while it looks like that the roots on this side are the roots that are the options for the others. So there is a kind of othering. Whenever you invent origins, we invent the other. So there is an ego, a self, and the other on the 2 margins of the river, so to say. So this is metaphorically speaking. It's just a metaphor. In fact, I look at the buildings right in front of the river on this side of the bank to hide, probably, the rest of the landscape where the different temporality is. Is this abyssal line a kind of fatality of Skopje or Macedonia? No. Because I look at the bridge. It's probably a Roman bridge, but the bridge from the Ottomans in 15th century. The bridge is the link. Everybody crosses that bridge every day. Let's imagine that the bridge is the linking of pasts, of different memories, of different histories. Is it possible to transform the bridge, metaphorically speaking, into what I call an ecology of knowledges? And the different understandings of the past, because they are different understandings of the past and of the future, we will never live in the future. So we look at the past in order to understand the present and what we consider to be the future of the new generations. What is necessary for that? Suppose that is possible, and I think it is possible. I've been doing that in Andalusia, in Spain, in Portugal, recovering all the heritages, because it's in our food, it's in our language, it's in our color of the skin, it's in our books, everything. Why should we erase part of our history? In the name of what? It could be something, in fact, that we could be an asset vis-a-vis Europe. Why the Europe likes to come as tourists? It's not just because of the prices, because there are some quality in our regions that they have lost. And I have to tell you, living for 35 years, half here in the United States, I can see the poverty in social and cultural terms when I compare with some things that we live in our region. So we recover by trying to analyzing these heritages, we come to a different idea of self-esteem about ourselves. But what is necessary for that? And I end here with the idea that what is necessary is an epistemological break. It's not easy, quite frankly. It's what I call the epistemology of the South. What is the epistemology of the South? It is a proposal that I've been putting forward that there are three paradigms of knowledge in Western modernity. One are the knowledges after the struggle, Hegelian model. That is to say, knowledge because the owl of Minerva flies at dusk. That is to say, when the struggles are finished, things are calm and we start thinking and we start producing knowledge. Knowledge after the struggle. What is the problem with this paradigm? Is that after the struggle, we have only the knowledge of the winners of history. What is the knowledge of the losers? Is lost, disappears. Is not in the archives, even. So, the problem of the knowledge after the struggle, our universities, I'm going from here to Thessaloniki because they have asked me to give a talk on decolonizing the university. Because they are very much concerned with the idea of the history of the winners told by the winners. The Africans have a very beautiful say about this. They say the history of Africa has been told by the hunter, never by the leopard, by the victim, so to say. So I think that we have to do that because this is the first paradigm. The second paradigm was the Marxist paradigm, knowledge before the struggle. Marxism was a theory to develop the ideas for the working class to overcome capitalism and bring about socialism. But there was a lot of frustration with this paradigm also. We know that, and you know that. So I think that we need a third paradigm. Is knowledge is born in struggle. So the epistemology of the South is the intent to validate knowledge is born in struggle against capitalism, against colonialism, and against patriarchy. They are not just the three, because if I'm lecturing in India, I have to add caste system. But the castes are satellite dominations. The three main dominations are colonialism, capitalism, and patriarchy. I cannot imagine a capitalist society that is not racist and is not sexist. So if you want to change one, we have to change the three levels of that. So it is really difficult. But when we look at the knowledges born in struggle, you can see that one thing that fascinates me, and it's what I'm working on and I'm putting forward on the table here, is that knowledge, all the knowledges are incomplete. No knowledge has all the answers for all of us. I'm a social scientist, so I would never say a word against science. Science is precious, it's very important. It's a valid way of knowing, but it's not the only one. Because when I work with indigenous people, if I want to go to the moon, I need scientific knowledge. But if I want to know the biodiversity of Amazonia, I need the indigenous knowledge. For different purposes, I need different knowledges. So different knowledges are complete, incomplete, and all in different ways. There are knowledges that are very good to describe the physicality, the materiality of the world. There are knowledges that are very important and very good at describing spirituality. Western-centric knowledge is very poor in spirituality. We don't understand spirituality anymore because we have confused spirituality with religion. When I work with indigenous people and tell me, Professor, the river is sacred. The river is a spirit. I can't understand because spirit for me is something only humans can have spirit because I was trained by Descartes. So how can I say that the river has a spirit or be sacred? Because my God is up there. Their God is down there. You see? So we have been trained in such a way that our lenses do not allow us to see. That's why there are many alternatives in the world, but we don't see them. For instance, we look, and in my work I can't here go in much detail, but I show that, for instance, if you go to the business schools here, or the economic, I work at the School of Economics in Portugal, we only teach about capitalist economy. But by far the majority of the economy in my country, all the vegetables that come to my table, all the things come from small agriculture, from family agriculture. They are not capitalists. They are families that work as they have been working all the time. Why this agriculture is not protected by the European Union? Only the large industrial agriculture. So this is the tragedy, that this diversity of the world is not recognized because we don't have an epistemology that would allow us to see the diversity of knowledges. The limitations of science are very great. And the more we know about science, the better scientist you are, the better you know the limitations of your science. I learned that from a great theoretician of science, a great physicist, Nobel Physics Prize, Karl von Weizsäcker in Germany, in Max Planck Institute, because I used to be there, and the two directors were Jürgen Habermas and Karl von Weizsäcker, one for the social science and the other for physics science. And Weizsäcker at lunchtime would ask us, are there questions that science cannot respond? You know why? Because science only answers the questions that you can formulate in scientific terms. But what is happiness? Happiness. We cannot formulate scientifically happiness. There is no scientific answer to happiness. Why are we in this world? It's not a scientific world. Is your ancestors, your parents with you here? No, you cannot solve that problem in scientific terms, because we only answer the questions that can be formulated in scientific terms. So science is very good for information and knowledge, but very poor for wisdom. I learned a lot from people that were illiterate, that work in the communities with whom I would be working hours and hours. They would teach me about the wisdom of life, why we are here, what is the sense of life. They were dignified people living in undignifying conditions. For instance, squatter settlements. I did my PhD for Yale University living in a squatter settlement in Brazil. And these people lived in the worst possible conditions. But they had the spirit of infinity and dignity, and they asked for respect. So I have learned that these different knowledges allow us to see different things, to value different realities. And once you value the different worlds, then you see reality. For example, sometimes people get surprised, and I conclude in 1 minute, that I can see that Ibn Khaldun, I don't know if you ever heard of Ibn Khaldun, is a great philosopher, theologian, economist, sociologist, whatever, from the 15th century. Iain wrote a famous book in 3 volumes, Mukaddima, which is prolegomena of universal history. Well, I have considered, and today is beginning to be accepted, that Ibn Khaldun is one of the founders of the modern social sciences. But I was taught that only Durkheim, Max Weber, and Marx were the founders. And then I discovered them. And then I discovered a key concept in Ibn Khaldun that was appropriated by Durkheim without mentioning it. That's a very Western-centric thing. They go out there, they appropriate, they absorb, and they don't cite. Let's face it. It's the concept of asabiyya. Asabiyya in the Mukaddima is the concept that portrays solidarity, cooperation. In fact, Ibn Khaldun was at the decline of the Muslim society in North Africa, and he was very much concerned with the decline of society. People are losing the solidarity, the cooperation. Go to Durkheim. Organic solidarity is there. Precisely the same concept of solidarity has been used by Durkheim. How do we know that? Because a sociologist from Tanger, from Fez actually in Morocco, Fatima, discovered that Ibn Khaldun had been translated into French and Durkheim read the Mukaddima, but never cited him because it was an Islamic guy. You see, this is something that happens today and not just happened in the past, but didn't happen in the 14th century. So that's why sometimes I ask you, go back to your roots much further, much long duration, because you find beautiful things. For instance, I found a great philosopher from the 15th century, German, Nicolaus of Cusa, that has a beautiful dialogue with an Islamic, a Muslim theologian, a great philosopher, Al-Ghazali from Persia. And he cites him and dialogues with him on an horizontal way. But from the 18th century onwards, the Islamic people are primitives and so on, and the Islamic is the religion to be discarded and the philosophy to be discarded, but not in the 14th century, not in the 15th century, not in the 16th century. Only from the 18th century onwards, and particularly after the 19th century. So I invite you to reread, in a sense, the past through a kind of an epistemological transformation, which will take time. It has to be done at a deeper level in our personal lives. I have to decolonize lots of things. I have to decolonize my own Marxism, which is my basic train originally. I have to decolonize Western-centric. We have to know very well the Western tradition, and I think I know it, but then we have to unlearn in order to open space for other learning. I think that when I look at this city, when I look at our cities in Portugal and Spain, I see they are grounds, beautiful grounds for the ecology of knowledges, but only the elites, the universities, nationalists, and so on, prevent us to embark in this good adventure, I would say, the ecology of knowledges. That's my invitation. Thank you very much.
Okay, good evening, everybody. I wasn't expecting to hear about Ibn Khaldun, who is also a great historian, although historians in Europe never recognize him as such. I'm going to, I know that Viki would like me to talk about the deep histories and stratified archives of the Ottoman imprint, of murderous logics of European nationalisms, of gendered and racialized distinctions and discriminations, but I'm not going to do that also because there's an article which was published recently in New Formations, a journal called New Formations, Viki can tell you, and you can download it for free. You can download it for free. And also because when I was here in Skopje last year, I talked a bit about some of the arguments that are in that article. So I want to do something different. I'm going to try and adopt a more oblique, more of a slanting approach, and develop less a sort of vertical axis going into the archives, going into the depths of history, which Boa rightly said we need to do. I will be looking at that, but I'm thinking more in a horizontal plane, and I want to link together, as you can tell from the title here, I want to link together to talk about contemporary migration and modern art, and to see where that can take us. But I'm going to leave that to you to make the connections, thinking with the Balkans, not the Balkans as an object, and I agree with Boa, it's a problematic term which we can undo, but not thinking of it as an object or as a spatial object, but as thinking with it, setting a set of questions. So I'm going to try and set some questions tonight which can also be added to that and can help us to critically move across these spaces, perhaps seeking other knowledges, other possibilities. So I'm going to talk in the vicinity of the Balkans and hopefully avoid simply importing colonizing analysis, what we just heard about, that reproduce a certain European hegemony. And so thinking with the Balkans is also to think about the complex composition of Europe, which includes certainly Islamic world, certainly Ottoman world. Remembering the 17th century, the Ottoman Empire was considered the most powerful political power in Europe, not outside Europe, in Europe. So these are really very complicated questions. So, but however, what I'm going to talk about migration, borders, and national identities, and their critical undoing and reconfiguration that occurred this summer at a contemporary art event in northern Germany, Documenta 15. And I want to suggest, but I'll leave that to you to evaluate, that these arguments I'm going to propose to you now, linking contemporary migration to a modern art event, they throw a critical light into Europe, and with it, the so-called Balkan region as an integral part of Europe. So thinking with the Balkans as an integral part of Europe, and the critical light can be thrown into it by thinking of contemporary migration and this art event I'm going to talk about. And it seems also quite appropriate to talk about Documenta 15 in this building, which is no longer a public baths, but a museum of art, right? So to think about dead black bodies in the pleasure zones of Europe, dead black bodies in the pleasure zones of Europe, that is, dead migrants floating on the waters of the Mediterranean and are brought onto the beaches. And this is not only to emphasize the negated, destined for anonymous deaths of racial capitalism in the black Mediterranean. These bodies, they also throw into focus a world that exceeds the categories we Europeans have prepared for it. The question is not of migration. The question is not of migration. After all, Europeans have been doing it for centuries. The question is of rights. For concentrated in these images lies the history of the modern world attendant on justice. A beach is a limitless, could be a beach in, I don't know, southern Italy or in Spain, France, wherever in Greece. A beach is a liminal space. It lies between the presumed certainties of land and the ambiguous openness of the sea. On the shoreline, we register a confine, a frontier. It is where we can feel our grip on the world is slipping away. Today, on the northern shore of the Mediterranean, with the arrival of the modern migrant and refugee, we are increasingly reminded of this presumed threat and associated fears. So beyond Giorgio Agamben's noted evocation of bare life, the migrant acquires the exceptional state or condition of being that exposes the limits of European humanism and its vaunted universal rights. And we've just heard much of this being developed by Boa. She takes us to the edge of the abyss and beyond Agamben and much of modern philosophy. For the migrant, even if mute and lifeless, strips the political and philosophical paradigm of Europe and the West. Her presence interrogates our authority on the world. Today, the migrant crossing from North Africa and Asia, or trudging through the Balkans and amassing on the borders of Eastern Europe, reiterates Frantz Fanon's famous request of demanding human behavior from the other. Demanding human behavior from the other. We are the other. We are alerted to the restrictive prescriptions of European political philosophy, historically secured in the regime of property, John Locke, the authority of the state, and the ontological privilege of individual sovereignty. Suppose we were to think with migration, the sea, and the Mediterranean. Thinking with the histories and archives they sustain, we might begin to break away from the objectification of the world that serves only to confirm our subjectivity. That would mean acknowledging and disbanding the continuing constitution of modernity through our political and philosophical colonialisms. If, as many presume, philosophy is the autobiography of Europe and the West, then we will have to turn philosophy against itself and puncture or interrupt the inbred positivism of the social sciences. Modern European philosophy is centered on the sovereignty of the individual and premised on the central idea that the world and its objects, including non-European subjects, can be rendered transparent to its rationalisms, to its will. In other words, the problem is not what Occidental philosophy can identify and resolve, but a deeper one. The problem is philosophy itself, is this philosophy itself, and the disciplines and languages it endorses and sustains. And I think Stamatia is going to say something about this in a minute. Okay, so this phrase, chaos at Kassel, this phrase was said by the German Minister of Culture, Claudia Roth, in the opening days of the exhibition at Kassel. It emerged in the initial storm of accusations of anti-Semitism at this international art event, Documenta 15, where more than 800,000 people visited this summer. That takes place every 5 years in Kassel, a world-renowned exhibition of the contemporary arts. For the 15th edition, the artistic direction was entrusted to the Indonesian collective Runggrupa. Accusations began brewing months before the official, this is in January, before the official opening. The presence of the Palestinian collective, the question of funding, was signaled out for attention in a country where a recent law basically outlaws any criticism of the state of Israel, turning support for the Palestinian cause and the peaceful boycott, disinvestment, sanctions, BDS movement into a federal crime. There's also, I mean, I'm not going to go into this. One could now move into these images and open up a whole discussion about post-colonial repetition, reworking the Occidental canon to say something against the grain of the Occidental canon. You see members of the Israeli Defense Force brought into canonical Occidental paintings, but that's something else. That's for another talk. So subsequently, a caricatured anti-Semitic figure of a Jewish male, reminiscent of the stereotypes circulating in Europe in the early 20th century, and most notably in Nazi Germany, was identified in the work of the Indonesian collective Taring Padi. It was withdrawn and led to an apology by the group. So this is a close-up. The figure they're referring to, you see the person there, the guy with the black bowler hat. It's all deeply ambivalent, however, because all these figures are basically figures of Occidental power and repression. So you have somebody who's 007, MI5, CIA. You have somebody from Mossad, the Israeli security force defense. And then you also have this guy with the locks and the black bowler hat on which there is SS written. So it's all very deeply ambivalent. It's a very complex figure. But the problem was we were not allowed to talk about it. It was just simply closed down. In fact, first of all, they covered it in black, and then they had it dismantled. So it was withdrawn. Later, a further accusation arrived also from the depiction of an Israeli soldier mistreating a Palestinian child in a comic illustration by the well-known Palestinian artist Nahi Ali, who was probably assassinated by the Mossad in 1987, in the space devoted to the Archive des Luttes des Femmes in Algerie. Well, you know, Israeli soldiers do mistreat Palestinian kids. I'm not quite sure. We can't say that? Okay. And in the last day of the event, 20 films presented by a collective called Subversive Films. These are 20 films that shot, made in the late 1960s, early 1970s by Japanese filmmakers, documenting the Palestinian struggle, led to a call on September the 10th, that's 15 days before Documenta closed, that they should be withdrawn for the anti-Semitic and terrorist violence. And these films are, first and foremost, an archive. No doubt an uncomfortable and disturbing one that suggests that even Palestinians have the right to have rights. The 1960s and 1970s were the years of armed anti-colonial struggle in Cuba, Algeria, Vietnam, South Africa, Angola, Mozambique, Palestine, and many other countries worldwide. There were also the years in which Jean-Luc Godard formed the Zerger Vertov group in his pursuit of a militant cinema, when anti-colonial struggle and film underlined what Walter Benjamin called the communicative democracy of cinema. The embarrassing attempt at censorship, because that's what it was. There was a scientific committee made to discover anti-Semitic works throughout Documenta 15. The embarrassing attempt at censorship displays a fundamental failure to engage with the challenge these films pose, both as alternative narratives and histories of Palestine and Israel, and above all as a challenge to the status quo of a complicit and complacent image economy. Such images liberate us from the conclusive narration of the nation and the illusory coherence of balance and neutrality proposed by CNN and BBC News. Such images reveal the asymmetrical relations of power that structure the world. Unruly archives overflow the past and reopen history to another telling of time and place. They forcibly remind us that behind German and European guilt for the Holocaust lie deeper responsibilities for planetary genocide, from the Americas to Africa and Asia, and their centrality, as Hannah Arendt, Amir Césaire, and Frantz Fanon all insisted, to the colonial constitution of Occidental modernity. In this global archive, these films cannot be castigated as anti-Semitic. Their images explode the present with a disavowed past destined to meet us in the future. From the cracks in the facade at Kassel also emerged further issues involving homophobia, Islamophobia, and a generalized intolerance for non-normative lifestyles. In the public discussion and highly restricted debate on anti-Semitism, a distance was consistently maintained between that discussion, talking about anti-Semitism, and considerations of other forms of racism that would necessarily include black, brown, and Palestinian bodies. It was a form of white supremacy. Altogether, a somewhat perverse limitation, what is, and most blatantly was the case this time with Documenta, a global art event. So restricting any discussion of race, of anti-Semitism to a specific area had nothing to do with racisms elsewhere, both in Europe and around the world. In other words, the aesthetics were colonized. Other racisms, other genocides, and their centrality to the colonial constitution of the present were excluded from consideration, including earlier German colonialism in sub-Saharan Africa, both Southwest Africa and Eastern Africa. The opportunity for a radical re-examination of the histories that the scandal opened up was deliberately avoided. So much national authority has seemingly been invested in curating the question of anti-Semitism in exclusively German terms as a quick fix, a quick solution to complex historical and political issues. It marks a failure in German public life, where national identity is bound up with unconditional support for the State of Israel as atonement for the Holocaust. An absolutist solution, yet again, an absolutist solution. It was tried once in the 1930s, and they're trying it again. To close down discussion, in the name of a national sense of moral righteousness leads us down a well-trodden path. Europe is full of the debris of these savage dreams. So an incident of anti-Semitism had also drawn other historical context and colonial memories in Indonesia, transformed Documenta 15 into truly planetary significance. Art and politics, or aesthetics and ethics, to echo Wittgenstein, became one. Through inviting collectives, because there are over 30 collectors at Documenta, and each collector could invite other people, so at the end there are 1,500 artists involved. So through inviting collectors rather than internationally recognized individual artists, there were some, but nearly all were associated with the multiple souths of the world. Rungrupa insisted on the interaction of collective practices to create a lumbung. Lumbung is an Indonesian concept that indicates the surplus collected in the rice barn for communal distribution. This unplanned artistic and aesthetic excess raises profound interrogations that interrupt the institutional consensus at present directing the modern art world. A tentacular network emerged, stretching well beyond the buildings and events of Kassel, Europe, and the Occidental management of contemporary art. It involved a remarkable breakdown, interruption, and redistribution of artistic practices that breached the gallery walls, national confines, and the curatorial regimes, and the fetishism of artistic objects in both the museum and the market. The idea of collective art practices and the removal of an individual signature struck at the very core of the political economy of the modern art system. The liberal implication of the individual and property, of names and capital, unwound. Of course, there may still be products or art objects coming out of the process, but the premises for evaluation were radically changed or radically stunted. The existing global system of the modern art world becomes vulnerable to other questions and practices not automatically authorized by capital and the market, all of which explains the lukewarm, even hostile responses of curators, gallerists, and many renowned artists to the collectivizing or lumbung procedures proposed by the Jakarta art collective Rungrupa. Where's the art? Where's the art? It was everywhere, but they didn't want to see it as such. As Frans Fanon would have put it, this abandonment of Europe and its limited humanism is precisely an interrogation of the former's universalist pretensions, not only in artistic terms. The storm over anti-Semitism was initially stirred up by right-wing groups who these days are all pro-Israeli. I'm talking about Germany, but it's a general tendency across the West, who all these days are all pro-Israeli, having moved their hatred to Muslims and Islam. And then it was uncritically amplified in the German press. Yet, if we return to the artistic practices at work in Kassel, these provide another route into the debate. The question, which is too big for Documenta 15 to answer on its own, and why should it, lies most obviously in the charred history bequeathed to Germany and Europe by the Shoah. Centuries of Occidental anti-Semitism, transformed into murderous rationalization under the Nazis, have been dumped on the Middle East. Initially sustained by the British, after all, they gave part of the British Empire to European Zionists to create what then became the State of Israel. The post-1945 world has subsequently allowed Germany and the West to consider the Jewish question resolved through unconditional support of the State of Israel. Of course, it has resolved nothing, and certainly not the racist hierarchies essential to the colonial fashioning of Occidental modernity, both at home and abroad. The idea of responsibility should surely substitute for the category of guilt. A critical undoing of the absolute authority of anti-Semitism over the national narrative in Germany would then have to respond not only to the Holocaust as a specific historical event, but also to the colonial conditions out of which it emerged in the heart of Europe. In Origins of Totalitarianism, Hannah Arendt insisted most forcibly on this connection, which everybody in Germany has forgotten about. More than policing anti-Semitism, this requires, as another Jewish philosopher from the Maghreb, Jacques Derrida, has taught us, a willingness to take responsibility for a past still to be registered and worked through. This too is part of that story. That is a history still to come. To take responsibility for Europe's heart of darkness requires breaking present indifference to all forms of racism and listening to the counter-narratives of others. Taking this on, which was undoubtedly at work in many of the artistic practices of Documenta, involves turning the table around. At Kassel, it would have meant to commence from accusations of anti-Semitism to enter an altogether deeper and vaster space that is not only policed by Occidental concerns. In its artistic and aesthetic manifestations, drawn from practices and languages developed in the multiple souths of the planet, what occurred at Documenta 15 clogged, slowed down, deviated, broke the colonial clock with unauthorized grit, pushing its time out of joint. The linearity of liberal progress swerved into a sharper turn where we register racism as a planetary apparatus of power rather than simply a local pathology requiring a cure. The burning fuse of aesthetics and ethics acquired a fresh and energetic urgency and the potential of planetary combustion. The embarrassed and critical failure that led to censure by the governing body of Documenta and public authorities is revealing, and not only for Germany. And this brings us back to the beach. The body bags, migrants, and the necropolitics of the modern world. From Mediterranean seashores to the skies of Northern Europe, the refusal to confront the insistence of the past in its complex constitution of the present poses and produces both moral amnesia and political violence. The refusal to confront the insistence of the past in its complex constitution of the present produces both moral amnesia and political violence. It guarantees the asymmetrical relations of power and ensure the reproduction of the status quo and the existing planetary order. It blocks the request for social and historical justice. The storm in Kassel, which continued to the very last day and still continuing, suggests that other coordinates are required and that our language and knowledge will always be stained by such interrogations. Their purported neutrality and scientific credentials are pushed beyond scholarly and academic control. Contemporary migration and contemporary art are not merely posing problems and issues to be identified, objectified, and explained. They trouble and refute that drive for transparency and promote other perspectives and premises for our becoming in the world. In the run-up to Documenta 15, with hostility and accusations of anti-Semitism already brewing, Room Grupa, the Indonesian collective responsible for Documenta 15, they set up an online conversation series entitled "We Need to Talk." Symptomatically, it had to be cancelled. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Iain and Boa. Thank you very much for your generosity. Now we'll proceed with this round of interventions. I would propose for Professor Elizabeta Seleva to begin. Then we can continue with Slavco, maybe then Ivana, maybe, and Stamatia to conclude.
First of all, thank you for this pointing out at the problem of cognitive asymmetry and epistemological injustice that is ruling the academia and the so-called science. I'm telling this from the point of so-called West-plaining, actually West explaining the East or the South, all of its information and knowledge and values, etc. I'm telling this because Balkan, the region that I come from and I lived in and I work in, is considered first of all as a region of imported knowledge, as a perfect consumer of the knowledge coming from the abroad, as a quotational academia and academic context. What you said about the symbolic of youth and the pluralization of the Souths it very much reminds me of the work of Armando Nishi, whom I very much respect, because he also spoke about the pluralization of the South and the wretched from the South, the condemned from the South. And I think it replaced the previous production of the Orient. Now the South is the new Orient, probably, because it is a question of internal, as you've said, colonialism. I would call it crypto-colonialism, because it's not open as the classical notion of colonialism. So the South is the new inferior other. And the global South, which we all belong to, I mean, Spain, Portugal, Balkan, Macedonia, Greece, and other cultures and states, are really maybe fit to enter this decolonizing project in kind of a solidarity endeavor, because we can't do it by simply ourselves. Let me just point at three or maybe one more problems. One of that is that we are living in the time when we are reducted or limited to the contingency of our origin. Namely, the place where we are born to is a kind of our primarily determinant, which is not fair, which is, according to me, a neo-feudal approach, because we are not only our roots, we are not only our origin. I would remind a statement of Jacques Derrida, who was asked, where do you belong to, or where do you come from? And Derrida said, I am European among other things, meaning that he is Jewish, that he is born in Algeria, that he is also American by his career, and so on and so on. So we are Balkan among other things. I don't approve and I don't confirm that I should be restricted to Balkan, because Balkan became a kind of a heterotopy of the object. We are heterotopia, you know, we are not normal cultural space, or we are just kind of symbolic geography which is objective, which is condemned, as you said, which is made inferior. And it very much reminded me of a book of Alain Finkielkraut. It was entitled Imaginary Jewish, and we are also now re-established as Imaginary Balkanian. So we are ascribed a certain amount of features of complex, of inferiority, of whatever, and that's why everybody would like to escape Balkan. Balkan is the place where nobody would like to live, to continue to live in, and which place which everyone would like to be dismissed of. So as Jean-Paul Sartre said, the hell are the others. So here, the Balkan are also the others, or the hell of Balkan is also the others. That's why Ratko Močnik, the Slovenian philosopher and sociologist, said Balkans are always somebody on the east, somebody on the south, not we, not ourselves. Then two other features which is more very much interesting and indicative. First of all, Balkan and also Macedonia, the place where I come from, or my homeland, is primarily exoticized as a landscape, as a kind of culture which is very much interesting, but also very much exotic, which also means very much distant to the European heritage and cultural background. It means that we are kind of internal exotic orient of the continent or of the Europe as such. And then we are also in a process of landscapeization. So what people are always putting on the first place is the nature, the landscapes, the natural beauties, which is okay, which is very much true. But on the other hand, cultural heritage is ignored or neglected. The contemporary authors coming either from the arts, either from the scholars, science, whatever, are ignored, you know, are neglected. They're not so much interested as much, for example, going to this Balkan safari, meaning going to these exotic places, tasting this nice, tasty food, which of course is true, is authentic, it's not something false, but it is reduced to that kind of maximum the folklore. The folklore is interesting because it is, you know, folk dances, music, it is quite available, quite easily receptive and transparent. Let me just one more thing add now at this moment, because this is the rare opportunity to share my position with you, not my personal, but my, let's say it, theoretical. We all know about the seminal book of Maria Todorova, Imagining the Balkans, which was published in 1997, and it was published in USA. I point it out because it is a big question if that book would become so much influential if Maria Todorova continued to live in Bulgaria, here on the Balkans. What is the problem with this book? It is the book which was made to, how to say it, dismantle the Balkanism, or this internal colonialism of Europe toward the Balkan as the European other, the internal European other. But there is a problem in this book that I personally myself detected, namely in the chapter which is called Balkan in the Self-Designation. Maria Todorova is quoting, is including the opinions of many distinguished Balkanian intellectuals, no matter artists, film directors, visual painters and visual artists, and theoreticians from each of the Balkan countries except of Macedonia. And I think that it is the blind spot of this book. You know, this is a classical example, as you've said, that no knowledge is really completely innocent, and no knowledge is completely resistant to some kind of internal prejudices. so that our artists and intellectuals are here omitted in this book. So Macedonia is in this book, again, nice landscape, beautiful country, very interesting, unpolluted, blah, blah, blah ground. And I think this is the point where we can conclude that crypto-colonialism is always possible, despite the maybe declarative tendency of the book to dismantle the monster of colonialism or Balkanism as a subspecies of colonialism, and that we should pay attention to the fact that you've perfectly focused that there is no innocent view or representation, even in the academic core of the science, even if the academic core of these theoretical bestsellers, as the book of Maria Todorova definitely is. I want to say that she never corrected this problem or never explained what does it mean, but it just proves that it is never enough of taking care about these hidden prejudices, these hidden heterotopies which still persist, and that we, the people working on the university, should first of all pay attention and be critical and remain alert to point out at this injustice, because nobody is perfect. Thank you a lot. I'm sorry if I was too long, but thank you a lot for all of your advices.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you, Boa. Not sure whether it is an intervention, whether it is a question, maybe a just brief intro from, maybe not from the other roots, but from the bastardized and unrooted positions in both politics and epistemology, from the position of the avoided, or the avoided, a queer feminist position, which somehow always poses more complex problematic to even thinking cultural differences, especially when we start talking about Balkan as the other of Europe. I always wonder what is the Balkan and where are those that are others in the Balkans, and who already find in the Balkan local epistemologies a long history of violence and a position to be disidentified with. So if I may echo the words of Marina Gržinic, Slovenian video artist, theorist, activist, and one of the important names of the early 80s Slovenian punk and alternative scene. When they were asking in the early 80s who the fuck is the political subject, maybe my question in this direction would be who the fuck is the epistemological subject? Whenever we talk about these differences and counter-knowledges that come from different regions and that try to criticize in general the Western position. So two questions I think that come as important and that maybe I have learned from the history of feminist epistemologies, and Boa, you also in your work acknowledge your in-depthness to feminist epistemologies. So two things I think that we can still draw on feminist epistemologies when we talk about all of the problems that both of you opened. So maybe just a brief intro to be reminded of this history that you have also recapitulated very well. But in the history of madness, Foucault traces the emergence of a very specific event that marks modernity. Western modernity. Descartes' meditations, according to Foucault, marks an externalization and radical separation that makes impossible any dialogue between reason and unreason, rendering the experience so familiar to the Renaissance, unreasonable reason or reasoned unreason impossible. Senses, passions, emotions emerge on the path-breaking struggle of the thinking subject with truth, but just in order to be purified, made conscious and expelled from the fortress of reason. This meditative exercise coincides historically with the institutional confinement and social exile of an enormous group of unreasoned human beings, reflecting what is distinctive about human life and on what should be the priorities of a well-lived life, has issued in character ideals centered on the idea of reason. There is another story that can be told about modernity. In this story, reason includes madness, includes the flesh, includes the passions, but is its object of control, of knowledge and categorization, as necessary in the dialectical development of the self-conscious subject. In this story of modernity, reason has the leading role that would show humanity its way towards enlightenment and maturity. Nevertheless, the sovereign use of reason as an exercise of critical attitude upon humans' historical conditions is set in transcendental terms, above historicity, above contingency, within the universal structures and limits of knowledge. A third story related to modernity inaugurates a crisis at the very heart of modernity. This is the crisis of the abstract and universal subject, assumed to coincide with his consciousness, a shattering of the ontological security of the Cartesian subject. And none of these visions of modernity or the crisis of its project provides us with a comprehensive insight unless we reconsider the intertwinement of the ideals of the man of reason, as Genevieve Lloyd calls it, with its gendered nature and histories. Introducing gender as an analytical category for investigation of the modernist project is thus crucial for a comprehensive and critical epistemological project. And not only gender, but recently it has been done from queer positions, like when Paul Preciado goes and speaks in front of the Association of Psychoanalysts, and the title of the speech is "I'm the monster that speaks to you," radically shatters the positions of the heteronormative, heterosexist project, which has been crucial also for our critical post-structuralist traditions. So, considering this context, I think that it's important to emphasize that the most important merits of a gendered epistemology are to be found in the rigorous critique it provides by decentering, historicizing, deconstructing, and problematizing the universal, disembodied, rational, and masculine subject of knowledge. The scathing critique that gendered epistemologists have directed against the modernist epistemological subject represents a kind of a return of the repressed exposure of the particular social roots of all apparently abstract and universal knowledge. I contend that this critical gesture is employed by the means of demystifying the embodied character of subjectivity and exposing its situatedness in the concreteness of the historical, social, and material conditions, like situated knowledge, standpoint theories, etc., etc., deconstructing it as an affect of networks of power and discourses, especially in postmodern feminist epistemologies, by strategizing the sexual difference of the epistemological subject, as in the work of Braidotti, Gross, Elise Ligare, etc., and, even more importantly, setting this subject on the same ontological plane with matter and nature, by way of dethroning the universal epistemological subject by marking it as a political configuration. The critical gendered epistemology paves the way for the creation of counter-hegemonic discourses and knowledges whereby difference and otherness are considered as crucial in the process of knowledge production and are set as an ultimate ethical imperative for the epistemological subject in her practice. But what I find to be particularly interesting line, and if this first line goes in criticizing, which you have also emphasized, the position of the epistemological subject, the universalistic pretensions, which are patriarchal historically always. The other important line, I think, even goes into a more radical direction, and that is problematizing the position and the importance of the subject and epistemological subject, the position of epistemology in general, the obsession with epistemology. So it is a position which is pretty recent in feminist, post-feminist epistemological theories, which goes beyond the epistemological subject. So the overarching limitation of the gendered epistemologies, which I mentioned, is discernible in the overdue respect paid to the deconstruction of subjectivity at the cost of overshadowing the agencies of matter and the differential and unpredictable becomings of the world as agencies that resist epistemological subjectivity, organized his or her investigation, and changed the parameters of thinking the objective accountability of knowledge. So, furthermore, this position carries the risk of falling back in the traps of classical, the position that deals with the subject, I mean, falling back again in the traps of classical representationalist epistemologies, which reify the distinction between subject-object, culture-nature, mind-reality. This risky business of standpoint theories, for example, suggests a separation between knowers and known, a spectatorial conception of knowing, a contrast of the unity of the object to the multiplicity of standpoints, a related concern with the unity and identity of the knower, as Rouse argues. What comes forth as a necessary movement and immanent critique within the vast field, even in gendered epistemologies, is to shift the exclusive focus of gendered epistemologies from the knower and his location to the different patterns in the world and the different light in which the world and different phenomena in the world are being disclosed in different contexts. So, in this context, it is important also to bring into consideration this vast knowledge that radicalizes some of the core assumptions and contributions even in gendered epistemologies and feminist epistemologies. And within this framework, there is still certain understanding of the subject, which is the subject as an ecological subject, as part of an ecology of practices as well. But moreover, this framework contests the primacy of the epistemological project for feminism in general, and shifts the focus towards ontology, towards matter, and performative complexes and open apparatuses. So I think this is also an important point that forces us to think, and I would also like to hear maybe Boa, from your perspective, how do these different epistemologies go against the grain of epistemology in general? Again, the idea even of what you mentioned at the beginning, representing the world as our own. So, radically undermining even this assumption of any epistemological project, no matter how much we pluralize this project, and give space, give the world a world to become and to refuse to give us anything. And finally, I was wondering, and this is also a dilemma I have, how can we think even creation of knowledge from these historically emptied spaces, erased spaces, which are on the other side of the abyssal line, as you mentioned, when sometimes there are even much worse abyssal lines within the different lines, especially in this context, for example, on this and on the other side of the bridge, there are abyssal lines in which the less than human queer and feminist female bodies stand, and which cannot be traced to these roots, no matter how much we wander around different roots. So how can we think? Can we think difference? Can we think the excluded, the erased, as point of becoming and reconfiguration of knowledge, of politics, of social practices, without ending up in the idea of the proper, in terms of property, in terms of what is proper, identitarian proper, as authenticity, and without propriety? And or the other option is maybe, which was also a practice here in the 80s, not here in Macedonia, but in some of the ex-Yugoslav contexts in Slovenia in particular, of mobilizing these differences, the point of negativity as the nightmare of hegemonic orders, standing, even appropriating radically, initially, the very stereotype as the symptomatic, nightmarish point of the system. You are dirty, you're lazy, okay. Not as an authentic identitarian position, but as, I have to quote him, apologies to everybody, Zizek says, as a pose, as a punk pose, posing with this negativity as a nightmarish position. So I'm not proposing it, I'm just saying that how can we think these are like two options I've been always struggling with. So yeah, and just maybe to add to Iain about everything that you talked about document, especially this problematization of the, you nicely said that this Occidental management of arts institutions, the Occidental curatorial regimes, and the fetishism of the object. Again, I think that the ex-Yugoslav context, if it has something to offer, it has something to offer as a history, as a different possibilities for thinking this, as a space that didn't have the market, the art market, in terms of galleries, selling objects, etc., and also as a space that has had this very intense practice of collectives working in the field of art, sometimes even signing anonymously. Is it also the other in Europe? So maybe we don't have to maybe even cross the oceans in order to get to something that is within this history of Europe itself. So yeah, sorry for the time I've taken.
It's going to be difficult following this. Thank you, Slavko. Thank you both for this. My intervention was potential because I didn't know if I was going to be intellectually capable at this point of my day to intervene, but I felt the urge to. So forgive me if my thoughts are scattered. I discarded everything I planned to intervene with, but I'll try it this way. Since Viki introduced me to your body of work, and I've already intervened with some of this on your previous visit here. I've been interested in the abyssal line simply because I feel like I've been walking along it, be it personally, be it as a part of an organized or non-organized collective. And I want to make a maybe it's not acceptable, but I'll still make this parallel between the abyssal line in which we are as Anthropocene. So the inevitable climate catastrophe, the social and economical injustices. And I come from the field and from the position, let's say, of urban sociology, environment, and so on. And the theory of the commons, degrowth, all of the leisure-oriented disciplines and movements, and especially Elinor Ostrom's theory on the commons, which is actually empirically proving that what we call the indigenous knowledge and what she calls the frontline wisdom might be so far one of the rare resources of knowledge for how to handle, tackle, or at least mitigate the injustices stemming out of the climate catastrophe, and if not regenerate or generate more natural resources, at least to govern them sustainably. And so I'm looking at this, and on the other side of the abyssal line are the high-tech societies, the smart cities, the nature-based urban solutions, which only perpetuate this patchwork spatial planning and patchwork urbanism, and still doesn't take into consideration the interconnectedness, not only of the neighborhoods in the city, but of the capital city itself with the periphery, and going back and forth. The other thing I want to put in this perspective is the abyssal line of this nation state or national society I live in. The river of Vardar is not, the river of Vardar as an abyssal line is not such a radical proposal because it always has been one, except that maybe in the 15th and in the 16th century, the North Bank was the more developed place, the place where the economy and the leisure and the life of the city itself happened, and the South Bank, which now you see is more developed urbanistically and technologically, was the place where you would leave your horse and sleep and have reckless sex and drink and whatever. I mean, in some way. The city of Skopje first developed on the north part, not in the south part. So, and all my life I've been growing up and taking in the knowledge about North Atlantic Western Reformation and how we as a society need to reform our policies, our politics, our culture, all of the nasty characteristics of a Balkan environment in order to achieve this, this other side of the abyssal line. But once I was probably capacitated to look into the suppressed knowledge and the knowledge that's probably systematically been hidden away from me as a woman, first of all, I learned that although this country and the Balkans, they are physically not in the global south, they are, I mean, they belong to the to Europe, they're a part of Europe. Still, culturally, traditionally, and in terms of this suppressed knowledge or indigenous knowledge or frontline wisdom, which has been gained and garnered and nurtured only through struggles and through scarcity and through lack of, could be the answer to many of the issues that we don't find through the Reformation that we're trying to do to achieve this North or the developed West and so. And so I'm interested in this sort of cognitive dissonant position. Do we need to cross the abyssal line? How do we cross it? Is it only possible to do it by radical individual acts, such as when Jean-Luc Godard refused to use Kodak films because they were developed only for white skins? So yeah, I'm just interested in the way to cross. Is it visible anywhere else except in the communities which, through colonization of knowledge and politics, have remained and still remain hidden to us? Thanks.
Thank you. Now everything has been said, so I don't really know what to add. I think the Slavco came to my room last night and stole my notes because he said exactly what I wanted to say, so I don't know what to say. So I'll just try to say maybe the same things, but in just a slightly different way, because those were the points that I also wanted to raise. So, thank you both for your presentations. I'm very happy to be here and very honored to be here. And I would like to start by highlighting one of Iain's propositions, that is the proposition of turning philosophy against itself. So in fact, it's been discussed a lot how modern European philosophy has created the juridical space and the ontological space inside which democracy, rights, freedom can actually become active and can acquire an active meaning. And this space created by modern European philosophy is the space of the human. So I think that the concept that it's really worth drawing our attention on is the human as it's been theorized by Western philosophy. Not to follow all the most recent post-human tendencies that are traversing the academia now, but exactly to turn our attention on the important concept of the human, because we really don't really want to just discard or abandon the human as we usually tend to abandon corpses on beaches, as Iain has shown us. So the human is the first important, most important living being that has acquired rights and that has managed to have rights. And this is the reason why the human has this kind of foundational character. But who is it that has the right to be called human, and so who is it that can actually then have all the consequent rights. So Iain has showed us how this definition of the human happens also through a particular lexicon. So there's been a particular language developed throughout history that has delineated and that has actually allowed the construction of what it means to be human. The human identifies itself through the use of a particular language. Or, as Afro-American thinker in critical race studies Sylvia Wynter says, the human is homo narrans. The human identifies himself, and I'm using the him with the capital H on purpose, through the stories that he tells himself. So it's basically a homo narrans that she identifies. We tell ourselves stories on what it means to be human and what it is like to be a human. In this kind of Western philosophical narrative, the other, the non-human, the less than human, the other than human, either is muted, so acquires the position of total, it's not a position, a total silence, or at best it becomes a disturbing noise in the background of this kind of rational knowledge and this kind of rational story, let's say. So one of the narratives that Western humans for millennia, actually not for centuries, but for millennia, have liked to tell themselves was revivified during the epistemological turn in the 17th and in the 18th centuries. So that was a period when some kind of stories about the human were not invented, but they were actually taken up again from a more distant past. Both Descartes and Kant knew very well that the term epistemology, the actual term epistemology, comes, as we also know, from the Greek episteme, which is specifically, and I'm just quoting the dictionary here, episteme in Greek, which in its turn comes from epi, which is a prefix that means on top, above, and the verb istame, to set or to place oneself. So episteme is basically to place oneself on top of something. Which means to be on top in order to have a clear view of something, which also means to know equals to appropriate something. And this is a particular paradigm of knowledge, as Boa was mentioning different paradigms of knowledge, so the episteme is a particular paradigm of knowledge. So epistemology comes from this combination of an episteme, a detached and hierarchical, I would say, knowledge, and the logos, which makes it even worse. Because the logos, notorially, is reason, basically, is a logical argument about something. It's the origin of Western rational language. So epistemology is basically a reasoning or a logical argument about knowledge. I am speaking very broadly, of course, in very broad terms now. And this is epistemology, and this is the way in which we like to represent, or we manage to represent the world as our own, to quote Boa again. So from the beginning, already in Plato's dialogues, epistemology then establishes itself as a foundational field to define what is the human. But the problem is not therefore what epistemology and therefore what philosophy can actually capture or what it leaves out, but as Iain was saying, the problem is philosophy itself. And therefore the problem is also epistemology itself as a branch, as a kind of subfield, not a branch of philosophy. And in fact, epistemology has developed itself throughout the centuries and the millennia, exactly in order, as one of the main responsible subfields that has defined the concept of the human. John Locke has been mentioned already, and for John Locke, epistemology was the study of the operations of the human understanding. And in Kant, it was the conditions for the operations of the human understanding. In any way, in either cases, epistemology is basically humans understanding their own understanding, cognizing their own cognition. Now, I like very much the idea of epistemologies of the South. Of course, I think it's an incredibly important proposition, but exactly because of the importance that the term epistemology is acquiring in these times and in our studies and in our researches, and also because of the way in which our linguistic and logical structures still so entrenched in these Greek classical roots, my question to you is therefore directed towards exactly this term. And I would like to direct towards this term the perplexity as positive energy that I read about in one of Boas' books. Perplexity as a positive energy. I would like to direct this perplexity towards the very concept of epistemology, just because I think it would be important to handle it with care. I might mention a lot of examples in which epistemologies of the South are becoming important nowadays. I work with the technology. My research field is digital technologies, and especially the field of artificial intelligence. And even without mentioning Gayatri Spivak and her need for an epistemological change, I would like to mention Jason Lewis. He is one of the members of a group that is called the Indigenous AI, Indigenous Artificial Intelligence Group. And they are trying to basically build technologies. It's a transdisciplinary group of programmers, philosophers, sociologists, artists, a lot of different fields. Trying to build computers and artificial intelligences that might work according to Anishinaabe, Kokiyé, Kanaka Maoli, and Blackfoot and Euskadun epistemologies. Another example is Hong Kong philosopher Yu Kui, Chinese philosopher from Hong Kong, Yu Kui, who talks about the Chinese epistemology inflected by the Tao, and he is also trying to rethink technology in terms of this different Chinese epistemology of the Tao. In short, all different examples and attempts to basically connect technology as we know it today with these epistemologies of the South, or these other epistemologies. And I am perplexed, again, about these examples, because they all start from one basic point. Technology is here. We cannot avoid recognizing that this technology is here, and we just have to learn how to work with it according to these different epistemologies that seem to be like attached to a technology that we already know, and maybe we can change it a little bit. This seems to live intact. First of all, the linear conception of time and progress is unquestionable. Time is progress, it goes forward, we have technology, and there's nothing we can do about it. We just need to find different possibilities to make technology work in a different way. I think that these other cultures, I would say, can do much more than this. It's just a matter of really listening to them carefully and pay attention to them. Just to conclude in terms of the Balkans, I'm not an expert on the Balkans. I won't even pretend that I read a lot about the Balkans. But what I can actually quote, and I would like to quote, is a few conversations I had here in these 2 days while I was here. And what emerged was, what struck me was the idea of the Balkans as a void. It's been repeated a lot of times, and I found it in my conversations in this day. And it's something that I found in the text of an art historian and critic, pardon me for my bad pronunciation, Luisa Avgita, I don't know how to pronounce it. I don't know if you know her. I found this, and it was a text she wrote about an art exhibition in the 2007, and the exhibition was called Blood and Honey, Future is in the Balkans, and the article by Avgita was published on third text. And she basically said that the Balkans doesn't exist. I'm quoting her, there is no Balkan side of the Balkan story because the Balkans does not exist without the West. Now, this idea of the Balkans as a void, I really liked it, not, of course, because of the void as emptiness, but the void as black hole, as Boa was also saying, and I like the idea of the black hole. It's something that I found in black studies as well and in critical race studies. The void of the black hole is a place of potential. To quote a different Greek example, again, not the classical Greek philosophy of Plato, but another current of Greek philosophy that has been a little bit discarded as well, which is the Epicurean philosophy. Epicurus already spoke of apiri cosmi, infinite worlds. So the potential of the Balkans might be a place for infinite worlds to emerge, a multiplicity, as Maurice Blanchot also said, of infinite intersecting intensities, or many different ways to be human, as Sylvia Winter also said. So this potential, I won't even try to define it, but I really think that it could be defined here in the Balkans, in this place. Thank you.
I would be very much happy if we can, let's say, finish here. I'm not sure if we can. I don't know if Iain and Boa has the urge to answer to some of the things that were posed. Yeah, but also, yeah, our scrollable attention is also finished. Mine for sure. So, if are there any questions maybe for the public, or we can be very happy to finish?
Yeah, just a brief question for two of you, because you said that you mentioned the post-structuralist Van Arden, but she and together with other post-structurists said that concentration camps didn't disappear. On the contrary, whole Europe has become a concentration camp, and centers of these concentration camps are the universities, and you two are university professors. So tell me, how do you think that you actually avoided of becoming a philosopher of colonialism? Thank you.
Before getting to that, I want to talk a bit about this idea of walking the abysmal line. Looking for who the fuck is the epistemological subject. I think walking that line around the void, the black hole, while listening or responding to dissonance. The only thing, there's two things I want to say here. I think they are thinking also with and from within the complexities, the histories that are sedimented here in the Balkans, but they're not only peculiar to the Balkans, in the sense that they take on different forms, different configurations across the world, and even across asymmetrical relationships of power that structure the modern world. That is to say, one, I think it's always about a collective response rather than individual leaps. And I think it's the collective response. Obviously, it's through the languages and the means you have. So I think it's much to do with reopening archives. It's about, when we talk about archives, I don't just mean those things, those institutions, you get a key and you look and examine documents. I mean, everything is an archive, right? So, I mean, I work with music. I work with Musics in the Mediterranean, where musics sustain archives and sound, even though those archives are not registered or recognized by institutional or authorized history. So I think it's about the question, as Stamatia was saying, about the centrality of narration, sort of about re-narrating archives and histories through the complexity, understanding the constitution of the complexities of the present. And that's a gigantic work, which of course interrupts the whole understanding, the liberal understanding of time, linearity, progress. It's about, the past does not pass. It somehow accumulates as a set of ruins in the present, which can potentially always interrupts and interrogates our understanding time, place, whose time, who has the right, or who the fuck is the epistemological subject. And at the same time, of course, these are very complex questions, and it is always about learning. And I think the argument about feminist epistemologies and arguments coming out of critical race theories are also are very important. But I want to say a very simple thing, which comes back to the question of roots. I think, I think it's something I learned from the Caribbean, from reggae music. The argument that the reggae musicians make all the time, that roots become roots. I know it doesn't work in American English because roots become routes, but in English, the other English, the one from the old Central Empire, roots become roots. So it's about thinking about how traditions, what you inherit, are always a site of transformation and translation, and that works both ways. Things are translated into your locality, but at the same time your locality is transforming and translating what is brought in, whether it's imposed or acquired or whatever. And I think that's so. I think that idea of the Balkans as a void, but a void as a black hole of energy and potential. I think it's something that I've been trying to do, and what Marta Cariello and myself have tried to do in our article, The Edges of History, is to try and make that argument about all the so-called questions of Europe, questions, democracy, the human rights, what has occurred and what is occurring historically and what has occurred in the Balkans. I don't just mean what has occurred over the last 30 years, I mean what has occurred over the last 500, 600 years, raises very significant questions for what do we mean by Europe? Who has the right to narrate it? Who has the right to define it? And I think, and that's why I insist all the time about, the centrality of the Balkans to the composition of understandings of Europe, which also brings brings with it much deeper sedimented histories about the Eastern Mediterranean, about the making of a Europe, which actors or which polities and political and cultural and historical formations have been excluded from today, but which have been central. This is what Bo was talking about, Islamic culture from the 8th century onwards, and also the centrality of the Ottoman Empire. So, I mean, those things, to bring them back into play, cracks the narrative, breaks it apart, and all the complexities which allow us to talk about who the fuck is the epistemological subject in a much more complicated way, registering those histories and also within the specificities, political, cultural, and historical specificities of the present. So it's about rerouting as well. Roots lead to rerouting and reworking and no guarantees, etc., etc. Okay.
This is correct? Okay. Well, I wish I could have read your papers, because some of you, the three of you at least, read papers. And I'd like really very much to know them, because and to read them. I hope that you send me those papers. I have my email available, because the questions are very, very important, very interesting. And since I consider that knowledge is a collective endeavor, as Iain just said, I think it's always a work in progress, and progresses as we talk and discuss. I've learned a lot from this session. What are the things that I think need to be worked out, in a sense? First of all, our professor, I'm sure your name I didn't... Elizabeth. Our colleague Elizabeth. Well, I think she realized, I'm absolutely in agreement with you as what we said, particularly because I think that the idea that this way of knowing, the Western-centric dominant form of knowledge, by creating the abyssal line, by creating and having, it's not the problem of having criteria about rigorous knowledge. It's about controlling the criteria in a monopolistic way. That's the problem. And once you do that, our knowledge is a consistent production of non-existence, what I call the sociology of absences. So I read Maria Todorova, and I did notice the sociology of absence that you identified. I didn't identify the absence of Macedonia, but you did. So that is to say, from different perspectives, we discover the different absences that are being produced. So the production of non-existence is one of the most efficient ways of controlling reality. Because in fact, we expurgate that reality from whatever you don't want, or it's not convenient for your strategy, be it an epistemological or political or so on. The second point to your question, to your comment actually, is that when I speak about knowledge is born in struggle, subaltern knowledge, which are usually also subaltern populations, subaltern bodies, I am not saying that it is important to recognize this knowledge. That is to say, not to legitimate all of them. You know, I've been working with subaltern communities in which much of the traditional knowledge is male chauvinistic, is sexist. That's why I never speak about dialogues, but about ecologies of knowledge. That is to say, when we encounter the knowledge, when they start communicating, they have to enrich each other, and they have to transform each other. And I have, concrete cases in my work. For instance, the women in South Africa, they want indigenous knowledge, but they want to be equal to men. So they want to change the traditional knowledge, because all the knowledges have to be transformed. And in this case, it's transformed by the ideas of the West. That is to say, this ecology is a reciprocal type of transformation. The problem is that Western-centric has forced some knowledge to assimilate, to appropriate Western-centric without reciprocity. And I think that's the problem. That's why when we claim the Balkans as a center of knowledge or production of knowledges, it's not because it's good for the Balkans. Is good for the world. I mean, the conceptions that indigenous people today are telling us about the concepts of nature are not just good for the Indians, are good for us, because they are at the roots of the ecological revolution. So I think that the diversity of the world is what we should struggle for. Why is that? Because one of the most intricate problems, I mean, Plato is probably the best in analyzing this, and that's why Plato used dialogues, not Aristotle, but that's another question, is that I think it is as plausible to look at life and the world as a unity as it is to look at it as a diversity. It's a Gestalt question. I mean, sometimes we see the unit, sometimes we see diversity. And in fact, sometimes we favor diversity, and diversity could lead to utter fragmentation, for instance. I think capitalism likes diversity of the others. And this is the trap, because divide and rule. I mean, rule by dividing people. That's why I have seen many feminist movements that are pro-capitalist and are racist. I have seen anti-capitalist movements that are racist and sexist. So, and anti-racial movements that are really sexist. Well, I work a lot with rappers. When rappers started, they were very racist, very sexist. And now we have women rappers, and they have transformed the lyrics of the rap. So no knowledge is complete. No knowledge is beyond this suspicion of serving certain interests. So the idea is that probably the world should benefit for really a kind of an articulation between unity and diversity. That's what I call ecologies of knowledge, intercultural translation. Intercultural translation is never about absolute transparency, but it's not about total opacity either. Because what I'm concerned with social movements today is that we are creating identitarian ghettos. I mean, I've seen some of radical feminist movements, in some anti-racial movements, the identitarian ghetto. So this is my struggle, you don't understand, you cannot share it, and I cannot be with you in the struggle. That's what capitalism wants, to divide us. So can we really try to have unity with diversity and diversity with unity? Not total union, not total diversity. That's why we need a political system. So I think that the first question is to really measure the questions of unity and diversity. The second one is the question that comes from the colleague and Stamatia about the questions of epistemology. Well, I think when I speak about epistemology of the South, I use the concept as an occupy concept, occupy with a K. That is to say, I'm trying to occupy the concept of epistemology. Because as Stamatia said, and very properly, epistem, not only just knowledge about and above, but also separate knowledge. Epistemology is about knowledge as a separate endeavor. When we talk about the epistemology of the South, knowledge is born in struggle. By definition, they are not separate from the practices. So they are embedded, they are embodied in the practices, and therefore this is a counter-epistemology almost. It is a political process of creating really the possibility that the peoples, instead of sharing information with me, as I was trained as a sociologist, I have the knowledge and you give me information in an interview. Now, when you are talking to me, you have knowledge, and I have to respect your knowledge. I was trained not to respect your knowledge, because I have the relevant questions. If I ask something and you start talking about something different that I'm not relevant, I stop you and say, I'm sorry, man, but this is not relevant for my research. This is extractivism. This is, as in the mining industry, it's the same thing. And in the mega data, I know that you are involved with big data, data mining. Look at the metaphor. Mining like the mining industry. That's what we do today. We are mining human resources, not just natural resources. What is now all these technologies of technological information of artificial intelligence is really extractivism of the worst kind of human resources. Our privacy, our identities. So I think that you have to change the concept of epistemology. And the idea is, I never speak of one epistemology, of course it's in the plural. And in fact, I'm trying to use this concept in the same way as the indigenous peoples use the concept of human rights. If you are inside the community, they never speak about human rights. The concept is a non-concept for them. They don't have the concept of rights of humans. Why? Because the idea of the humans, as you say, is our Western-centric idea. Because while we speak of the idea that nature belongs to us, they start from the principle that we belong to nature. Well, that's completely opposite principle. So we are part of the nature, and in fact, nothing is done here on my body without nature. Why should the body and we be so distant and different from nature? So it is a different conception, and the concept of the human is precisely that. For instance, today the debate on the Anthropocene is also another reworking of the humanistic idea, and that's why many people talk about the Holocene and the Wastocene, because it's not the human. Not all the humans are producing the ecological catastrophe. The North is producing 80% of it, and is trying to transfer the costs to the people down south. So I think that this idea of the South is also complex, because it's not a geographical South, it's an epistemic South. So the South occurs in the North. When the Muslim immigrants in Paris are struggling against the abyssal exclusion by the police, well, that's the South for me. They are resorting to their own knowledge in the core of the first arrondissement. So it's an epistemic South. There's nothing geographical about it. So they are other topologies. So I think that, look, our life, human life, is 0.01% of the total life of the planet. 0.01%. How come we have dared to destroy the nature, the planet, being such a tiny minority? Well, I think the Gaia hypothesis makes sense. I mean, probably the planet will go on without us. What is at stake is the extinction of human species. Well, the other species probably will go on in a different way. So that's why focusing on human life and not on life in general is what is producing the necropolitics. Because it's not a destruction of nature, it's destruction of our own nature as separate from the other nature. So I think it's a lot of reconceptualizing things, and it takes time, and this is a generational type of thing. The third point is the abyssal line. Of course, this one dear to you, and I'm glad that you are working. I would like to know more about your work and be in touch with you, because it's in my group is the work that we are working most intensely now is on the abyssal line. Well, is the abyssal line a line or a zone? That is to say, it's dense, it's thick. How thick it is? And as it happens with my theories, it comes from empirical work. For instance, I noticed that during the pandemic, the elderly people in Europe, even though they are considered to be protected and therefore are on this side of the line, the protected side, human rights, democracy, and so on and so forth, came the pandemic. And many of them were abandoned and moved to the other side of the line. They ceased to be full humans because we have to take care of the younger ones. The elderly ones are lost anyway. And I came to this conclusion when I saw in Madrid a residence for elderly people that the armed forces went there after days of confinement, and there were hundreds of people dead there. That is to say, the elderly people had been completely abandoned in downtown Madrid, because they really were moving. So the other thing that we are working is how people go from the protected zone and cross the Ibiza line. Well, the women, when they work, they may have rights. When they go home, they may be assassinated by the partner. They moved from a non-abyssal exclusion to abyssal exclusion. The life of many people of the world is to cross the Ibiza line every day. You see. So that's another concept in which we are working, because I think then the plurality of the Ibiza lines are there pluralities, because of course whenever we have a dominant knowledge, it creates a Ibiza line for one simple reason, is the binary oppressors oppressed is also complex. Because a worker that beats his wife is also an oppressed and an oppressor. And we all of us, the distinction between oppressors and the oppressed is a question of the quality of the elements of oppression in which we are on the side of the oppressor and the side of the oppressed. And that's why there are many divisions within feminist movements, within the anti-racial movement, because there are also hierarchies within the movements. So I think that we have to work the idea of the Ibiza line is the only critique I can make. I think is the most effective one against the liberal theory. Because the liberal theory cannot recognize the Ibiza line. All of us are equal and free. And that's why the Ibiza line is as radical as is invisible. We don't see it. As we don't see the ecological catastrophe, because we see what we see. We see a river that is contaminated and there, but we don't see the catastrophe. And that's why also, and I've discussed that with rappers, is that you may cross the Ibiza line, but the community for whom you are working does not. I start working with a guy that then changed complete Kanye West, many in the late 80s, Kanye West and Jay-Z. Well, these people, when they became famous, they abandoned the communities. The communities, the black communities in Harlem, are as impoverished and are abyssally excluded as now, but they moved to the other side. So sometimes you move individually, but we don't move collectively. So this is the other thing that I would like to add. The humans is already the type of thing that I said. And I think that we could go on the conversation, but it's already 10 p.m., so we have to eat. Thank you very much. Okay, good. Thank you.